Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of living nature, with deep gratitude to all the generations before us that have brought us to the present moment in our human journey, I want to welcome all of you to this session of Humanity Rising as we embark on day 2 of a 10-day program on nonviolence. And we want to welcome all of you to this program. We are going to be dealing today with some of the great avatars of nonviolence: Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. As we think about that, I want to make a brief comment on the election just this past Sunday of Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who is set to take over the reins of government with her coalition partners that won 44% of the vote in the Sunday election, to just make the following very brief observations. It was 100 years ago this month, in 1922, that Benito Mussolini, the founder of the fascist movement in Italy, began the final preparations of his march on Rome, which swept him into power and to the fascist dictatorship that, in alliance with Nazi Germany, brought the advent of the Second World War and the carnage that ended up with between 50 and 70 million people dead and nuclear weapons used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was also 100 years ago this month that Adolf Hitler was making the final preparations on the putsch that was to seek the overthrow of the Weimar Republic. He was arrested. He was put in prison for a 5-year term, but he was released by popular demand after only 9 months in prison, during which he wrote his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And you all know that the rest, as they say, was history. Although it's worth just noting that this arc of the fascists in Italy with Mussolini and with Hitler came to an end during the same week, within just 2 days of each other. In April of 1945, at the end of the war, Mussolini tried to escape Rome disguised as a woman. He was captured. He was shot. He was then taken to Milan, where he was hung upside down. And within 24 hours, Adolf Hitler blew his brains out in the bunkers in Berlin. I note this because the fascists in Italy reassembled themselves and created a party that participated in the post-war democratic processes of Italy. That party has shapeshifted a couple of times, and the leader of that party is Giorgia Meloni, a very self-confessed admirer of Mussolini. The symbol of her party, the flame, has been used by the fascists for the last 75 years. And all the accoutrements of fascism are embedded in her political rhetoric. So it's very important for us, particularly in the United States, as we also see the rise of authoritarianism and fascist tendencies, to be very aware as we're discussing nonviolence, that the authoritarian, totalitarian, fascistic tendencies of the human psyche are alive and well, and in fact gaining the ascendancy, so that as we spend time contemplating the wisdom and virtue of nonviolence, as we will today by an examination of some of the great paragons of nonviolence in Jesus and Gandhi and King and many others, we should know that this is a very live discussion. This is not and academic matter, but our orientation around our commitment to democratic principles and nonviolent principles is in fact the very viability of the democracy we seek to maintain. Before we dive into this program, let us just pause as we always do and breathe together with a coherence breathing that is very, very simple, but is considered by science to be the most powerful way that a human being can breathe, by harmonizing all your body processes, bringing coherence between your heart and your brain, balancing your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems of your body, and massaging all your organs in a way that optimizes everything you need to navigate the world in which you find yourselves. Very simple. We'll put up an art card. You'll hear a bell, and breathe in very slowly for about 5.5 breaths. And then the bell will ring, and then exhale very slowly. You hear another bell, inhale. So you're breathing in for 5.5 seconds. You're breathing out for 5.5 seconds. For 5.5 breaths a minute, that brings in 5.5 liters of air. And we'll do it for 15 breaths. And then we will commence our program. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. In a world spinning out of control, there's nothing more important, in my view, than to increase your inner equilibrium and the capacity for fortitude in your interior. And that's what this particular breathing technique is designed to do. It's thousands of years old and only discovered by modern science, which is indicating that it is a maximal way to increase your internal coherence. The more chaos on the outside, the more coherence we need on the inside. And that's why we offer this breathing technique every day on Humanity Rising. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce the trailer for the film, The Third Harmony. And by doing that, introduce Tom Eddington, who's the executive producer of the film, along with a number of other films that he's done as a business consultant and CEO of Endangered Global. Tom is passionate about nonviolence. He's passionate about preserving the 1 million species that are endangered, which now includes the human species, and has been very dedicated, along with George Caponelli, the founder of Age Nation, in a partnership with me and others that are really developing Humanity Rising and evolving Humanity Rising into the Humanity Rising Network. So, Tom, I want to thank you, and Georg, if you'll put the trailer on, and then when the trailer's finished, it's only 2 minutes long, Tom will commence our program. Thank you, everyone.
It seems like every one of us has this big library of humanity and nonviolence inside him.
One thing we have in common as individuals, as human beings, is the power to show love. The basis of nonviolence is love.
Governments have spent billions and billions of dollars getting violent science right in the past 400 years. And I think that it's time that we invest some time and energy into alternatives.
Our evolutionary mandate is to move into the peaceful cooperation, because we see now that we're destroying our own infrastructure, we're destroying the planet we depend on.
If you start from the assumption that everybody has a good core in their nature, that we're all deeply interconnected, that there is no problem which cannot be resolved to the benefit of all parties. If you start with those assumptions, and even if you don't believe them, you take them on as a hypothesis, as assumptions, and you test them, and you find out that it works.
We have to think big. Sojourner Truth didn't think small, Martin Luther King didn't, Gandhi didn't. They had big, bold ideas.
Seeing it firsthand, seeing the power of nonviolence, and feeling we really have the power to make history, to change history.
Thank you, Jim. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to have another day with all of you joining us. I'd like to start by bringing in my dear friend and co-host and co-moderator and the person responsible for the Third Harmony and for these 2 weeks, Michael Nagler. Michael's an emeritus professor of classics and comparative literature at the University of California, Berkeley, where he taught in the Peace and Conflict Studies program he founded on the campus in the 1970s. In addition to teaching at Berkeley, Michael speaks frequently for media and the general public on issues of peace and nonviolence, does presentations around the world for the Blue Mountain Center for Meditation. Michael's written 6 books and contributes articles frequently to Cocoon, Yes, and other progressive magazines and journals. He's consulted with the U.S. Institute of Peace and many organizations and projects dealing with nonviolence. And he's the writer and director of the Third Art Harmony. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much, Tom, and welcome to everyone. I have a rather serious message that by coincidence arrived in my inbox about 5 minutes before we started. And it's from a student of mine and a friend of mine in Tehran. Her name is Psyche. And I just wanted to read you her very, very brief words to all of us. She says, "Just please be our voice. Tell about us to the world. We are in a terrible situation, a disastrous situation. Many people were killed." So that is, if anybody still needed a reason why nonviolence must be learned and practiced, I think this was a kind of an echo of what Jim was saying. That was 100 years ago. This is happening right now as we speak. And perhaps, who knows, we can have a good influence on the situation by the vibrations, by the wavelengths and the thoughts that we share here this morning. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Michael. I'd like to introduce the rest of our panelists for today. Before we get started, Ken Buddigan is joining us. He's a good friend and colleague. Ken is a senior lecturer in the Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies program at DePaul University in Chicago. He's worked in a series of movements for social change, including campaigns addressing homelessness, nuclear weapons, freedom for East Timor, and the U.S. wars in Central America and Iraq. In the 1980s, he was a founder and national coordinator of the Pledge of Resistance, which was nearly a decade mobilized nonviolent actions for peace in Central America. Since 1990, Ken has worked for Pace Bene Nonviolent Service, which has trained tens of thousands of people in the power of nonviolent change. He serves on the executive committee of Pax Christi International's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, which has co-sponsored 2 landmark conferences on nonviolence in the Vatican. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Tom. Great to be here.
Marie Dennis is a senior advisor, a friend and colleague, and advisor to the Secretary General of Pax Christi International at the Global Catholic Peace Movement, a program chair of Pax Christi's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. She was co-president of Pax Christi International from 2007 to 2019, and is a Pax Christi USA Teacher of Peace. Marie was one of the primary organizers of 2 conferences on nonviolence and just peace in 2016 and 2019 that were co-sponsored by the Vatican and Pax Christi International. She's an author or co-author of 7 books, editor of Choosing Peace, The Catholic Church Returns to Gospel Nonviolence, and co-editor of Advancing Nonviolence in the Church and the World. Welcome, Marie. Adam Erickson is the executive director at the Raven Foundation and the pastor at Clackamas United Church of Christ, just outside of Portland, Oregon. He studied the work of Rene Girard in relation to nonviolence and Christianity for 15 years. He wrote his master's thesis titled Love and Nonviolence in Christianity and Islam. It compares the 20th century nonviolence movements of Martin Luther King Jr. and Abdul Ghaffar Khan. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
And finally, Francesca Poe. She's a scholar of religion, specializing in contemporary religion and non-religion. She's currently a member of the board of directors at the Meta Center for Nonviolence in Petaluma, California, an educator at Mater Dei High School in Santa Ana, California. She previously served in the U.S. Peace Corps as well as a high school campus minister, and is co-editor of Religion and Peace and the Study of Ministry. Welcome, Francesca.
Morning. Thank you.
Ken, would you like to get us started today?
I sure would, Tom. I'm very grateful to be with you and everyone around the world taking up this very, very important theme. The greatest movement in human history is coming. Why? Because it has to. We have to respond to white supremacy, economic injustice, the environmental destruction we see everywhere, questions of poverty, what we're hearing about in Italy and in Iran. All of those things cry out for response. And I'm very grateful that this particular program is inviting us to look at what are the deep roots in our religious traditions that can assist and deepen and broaden what we need to do to respond to the crises of a culture of violence and injustice. The historian of religions, Karen Armstrong, has said, every single one of the major religious traditions all began in extremely violent societies. They came to birth in times like our own, filled with violence, and all of them took a position against violence, illuminating what lay at the core of it, which is largely egotism, fear, greed, and hatred. We know this is true in many religious traditions, including Christianity, which we are going to be talking about this morning. Jesus called us to wean ourselves off from violence and to embark on the way of the divine life of peace and nonviolence. So broadly speaking, religion is a term that refers to the ultimate way of transformation, our deepest orientation or worldview, our most profound belief system. If we think about it, this can be realized either positively or negatively. It can be a path of formation in nonviolence or a formation in violence. The Christian scripture scholar, Walter Wink, says that the greatest religion on our planet is not Christianity or Islam or Hinduism, but the religion of violence. We believe that violence saves us. It's our way of last resort. The problem with that religion, the religion of violence, the religion of the violence with its beliefs, its institutions, its rituals, and its liturgies of war and all forms of public and private violence, is that it dehumanizes, diminishes, and destroys us, and really doesn't solve the problems that it purportedly tries to solve, often in the service of a larger domination system. In contrast, there's a different worldview, an alternative paradigm. Gandhi captured this when he said, nonviolence alone is the true religion for all times. Nonviolence is the dharma of awakening. Its votary has to make conscious choice of it at every moment as we are surrounded by violence on all sides. Every one of us has, according to our capacity, to make our own way out of this dangerous predicament. I'm so grateful we're taking some time to think about how do we all gather together out of this dangerous predicament. But when we speak of religious institutions and traditions, they often are tempted to fully embrace this violence religion. They often are tempted to reproduce the worst parts of the domination system. So the great prophet, theologian, pastor, Howard Thurman says in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, religion means nothing if it doesn't speak to the person whose back is against the wall. Religion means nothing if it doesn't speak to the person whose back is against the wall. In his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, Thurman develops the idea that Jesus addressed the person whose back was against the wall. In his time, it was the existential reality of the occupation by the Roman Empire, institutionalized violence, oppression, threat, and destruction. Jesus announces a dramatic alternative to empire. He invited us to reject that system and to create another qualitatively different one. Why? Simply because God does not want us to be caught in systems of oppression. And God wants us to join in helping everyone else not to be caught in those systems. And how do we do this? By self-sacrificing love, solidarity, and forgiveness. In short, the nonviolent life, which is a radical challenge, not just to specific acts of violence. We see specific acts of violence, say, for example, in Tehran, but the overarching domination system, the overarching paradigm of violence. So how do we confront violence and oppression? We can run from it, we can accommodate it, or we can use counter-violence. Howard Thurman was one of the first theologians to reflect systematically on how Jesus approached these traditional scripts for responding to conflict and violence and oppression, including the structural violence of injustice, as he and his community experienced it in the first century under Roman occupation. From Thurman's perspective, Jesus understood that these three approaches, running from it, accommodating it, or combating violence with violence, were time-honored survival strategies, but they were ultimately ineffective and at cross purposes with the vision of a God who is love. In contrast to these traditional scripts, Jesus called us to a radically different script, the thoroughgoing rejection of violence combined with the prophetic power of unconditional love. Today, we call this core teaching of Jesus nonviolence, a clear stance against violence mobilized by love for our neighbor, for all peoples, for all of us are made, according to the Judeo-Christian scriptures, in the image and likeness of God. Jesus confronted the imperial, political, and religious realities that undermine personal and social well-being. For example, he demonstrated that true peace is achieved through nonviolent engagement and resistance, not through violence, not through lording it over one another, not through passivity. In his age rife with violence, Jesus proclaimed a nonviolent reign of God rooted in that unconditional love. Jesus called on his disciples to love their enemies, to offer no violent resistance to those who do evil, to become peacemakers, to forgive and repent, and to be abundantly merciful. Jesus embodied nonviolence by actively resisting systemic dehumanization, as when he defied the law to heal the man with the withered hand in the synagogue, when he confronted the powerful at the temple and purified it, when he peacefully and with loving determination challenged the men accusing a woman of adultery, when he refused to call down fire on the Samaritans who had rejected his message, and when on the night before he died, he commanded Peter to put down his sword. Nonviolence is at the heart of the way of the cross and resurrection. When Jesus told us to love our enemies, to put down our sword, and to become peacemakers, he was marking out a radically fresh way forward for humanity. Love of enemies is a powerful force, as peacemaker Angie O'Gorman declared, quote, by which Jesus meant wanting wholeness and well-being and life for those who may be broken and sick and deadly. It was meant to be the cornerstone of an entirely new process of disarming evil, one which would decrease evil instead of feeding it, as violence does. In short, he invited us to discover that there is another way than violence to resolve conflict and foster justice. This other way is not avoidance, appeasement, aggression, or attack. He suggested a dramatically different way. I'll close with these comments. In the early church, there was no separate word for nonviolence. There didn't need to be. The word Christian signified what today we call nonviolent. Being Christian meant, or was supposed to mean, rejecting violence, and loving one another. Being Christian meant taking up the nonviolent life as part of a nonviolent community. Being a follower of Jesus meant all the things that today we recognize as facets of nonviolence: praying for those who persecute you, performing the works of mercy, returning good for evil, refusing to support war, forgiving and reconciling with one another, especially when we've strayed from the nonviolent path. For the first 300 years, being a Christian meant saying no and saying yes. No to violence in all of its dimensions, and yes to the infinite worth and sacred dignity of every person. And so we've come a long way since then, but in this century, we've begun to see that that really was, at least in Christianity, the heart of the matter. And some of us are beginning to invite that tradition, ourselves and the tradition, back to that way of active and creative, liberating nonviolence.
Thank you, Ken. Francesca, would you like to share?
Hi, good morning. Okay, so a lot of the things that I've been thinking about lately is really connecting the third harmony into my work and into our individual lives. So we just saw the film, not the whole film, but the trailer to the film, Third Harmony. Third harmony meaning harmony within ourselves, developing a spiritual practice, developing a spirituality. And as you can see, my work is in religious studies. I'm also a high school religion teacher. So that all kind of ties together. I also do some independent work, with developing people's spiritual practices, anything from in the individual to group context. Anyway, so I just published this book, Religion and Peace. And my chapter in it is called Witchy Activism, Self-Religion in Global Peace Movements, and really looking at how contemporary religious movements can cater into peace and nonviolence movements, and how definitively, actually, a lot of these contemporary religious movements actually are what are helping a lot of the peace and nonviolent movements in our world. So a little bit more of a positive perspective. So I start with the idea of self-religion. Self-religion is my term for anything that we understand as New Age or post-New Age or inspired by the New Age. My title is called Witchy Activism because a lot of the contemporary religious traditions that are in that post-New Age movement, the term people are using is that it's witchy. So that's why I'm using that as my title. So self-religion, a lot of people think is could be narcissistic, that the self is the authority and it causes problematic spirituality in that way. But if from a sociological perspective, you could actually see that a lot of these movements, not the self that's authority, it's actually individuals that give authority to multiple authorities. So it's the ability to give authority to multiple religious traditions and multiple worldviews at the same time. The reason why people think that the self is the authority is because there is an ethic that's being taught in these movements, that a person needs to find their best self, their inner self, their mystic self, their inner self. And that's why the word self is being used, and it's giving this idea that the self is the authority. But really, when you actually look sociologically, these individuals are giving authority to multiple worldviews and multiple religious traditions. And then to go to our topic, I look at different global peace and nonviolence movements throughout history, and I demonstrate that a lot of the religious trajectories and the religious leaders of these peace and nonviolence movements are actually individuals or religious traditions that have this self-religion or this ability to hold multiple authorities and teach the ethic of the self. So starting with Gandhi, we know that he grew up in a Jain region. So he's Hindu, but he grew up in a Jain region. That's why he's highly influenced by the ethic of nonviolence. He was educated in the West, so he had a lot of Christian contemporaries and was influenced highly by that. He was also highly influenced by Edwin Arnold, who is a Christian scholar that translated a lot of Hinduism and also was inspired by a lot of Buddhism. So you can see that Gandhi was able to hold multiple religious traditions and multiple worldviews. Next, we have Martin Luther King Jr., who was trained by Gandhi in nonviolence. So we know that he is a Christian pastor, but he was trained in the nonviolence of Gandhi. So he took in a lot of Hinduism and Jainism and a lot of that, the Eastern spirituality within his own. And we know from there that Martin Luther King also was able to hold multiple religious traditions and multiple worldviews in his spirituality. And then going to Jesus, I'm not like a historical Jesus scholar, but with what I do know about Jesus, he comes from Nazareth. And during the time, Nazareth is seen as this place, a lot of the people in Judea, which is the capital city, would look at Jesus like, oh, who is this guy from Nazareth? Why are we listening to him? He's just this kooky guy. So Nazareth is known to be a place that had a lot of travelers, a lot of people from different worldviews coming in and out of it. And so we know that Jesus was actually highly inspired by a lot of different worldviews and religious traditions in his life. There are some scholars of the historical Jesus that have shown some evidence that there was some Buddhism that came into a lot of Jesus's worldview. And so there could be some connection between Buddhism and Christianity as we know it. We also know that Jesus taught this ethic of self-religion when in all the Gospels except for John, so a lot of the earlier Gospels, when people asked him if he was God, he would always say, what do you think? Who do you say that I am? So he inspired the individual. And this ethic of self-spirituality, finding your inner self, it's a lot of the taking away from the authority of like the mainstream authority and really looking at the person in front of you. And that message of love really is kind of what we know as this ethic of self-authority, so that you can hold those multiple authorities. So Jesus himself was able to hold multiple authorities, worldviews, religions. Gandhi was able to do that, as well as Martin Luther King. And really, a lot of this has always existed, but I'm pointing it out that we are in this time when every religious tradition, or even a lot of non-religious spiritualities, teach the specific ethic of being able to hold multiple authorities, hold multiple worldviews and religious traditions, and really hone in on that to develop into our own spirituality so that we're able to have the tools for these nonviolent and peace movements.
Thank you, Francesca. Marie?
Yes, thank you. That was very interesting, Francesca. Thank you. So back to a bit about Jesus. As Ken said, during the first 3 centuries, the Christian communities practiced the nonviolence that Jesus taught and lived. But after the Christianity was drawn into the empire and began to have more status in the empire, the spirit of the gospel nonviolence was maintained not so much by the whole tradition, the whole Christian community, but by individuals and some movements and small communities within the church. But what we thought might be interesting would be to trace the evolution of the commitment to nonviolence in the Christian, then ultimately the Catholic Church, to where it is today. So you would be familiar with what became called the just war tradition. It was at the center of Catholic teaching for well over 1,000 years. Its purpose was to restrict the resort to war by Christians in the public arena. And in the beginning, it probably did that. But ultimately, it became clear that the strictly defined limits with which the just war tradition intended to require for any resort to violent force, even at a public level, for a government to decide to go to war, there were strictly conditioned reasons. There had to be a just cause, there had to be a declaration by legitimate authority, there had to be proportionality in the means used, and so on and so forth. All of the conditions of the just war tradition needed to be fulfilled. What became clear in the 20th century was that the very nature of war began to change. Modern weapons became frighteningly destructive and increasingly impersonal. And also in the 20th century, thanks to the leadership of Gandhi, for example, and Dr. King, successful nonviolent campaigns for liberation from structural violence like colonialism or racism or occupation became better known. Catholic teaching on war and peace slowly began to shift, with an increasing emphasis on nonviolence as a possible tool for public officials, and on the restrictions intended by the traditional just war paradigm that were intended to make war extremely rare and a truly last resort. Every leader of the Catholic Church, from Pope Pius XII, especially John the 23rd in the 60s, and on until the present day, repeatedly and clearly articulated an abhorrence of war. They began to say more and more clearly that there are no just wars, and the current Pope, Pope Francis, has said that most clearly. For example, in 2007, Pope Benedict XVI, the predecessor of Pope Francis, said, quote, "Love of one's enemy constitutes the nucleus of the Christian revolution." And a few years later, he said, "Jesus came with only the strength of love, totally without violence, even to the point of going to the cross. This is Jesus' true message," he said. "Seek peace with the means of peace and leave violence aside." Pope Francis has underscored that emphasis again and again, pointing to the Church's yearning for peace and disarmament. He has repeatedly decried the world war being fought piecemeal, is how he describes it. He's called for the world to transform our conflicts without violence. He's emphasized integral ecology, emphasizing the fact that the natural world has intrinsic value and is also a victim of war and violence. He's highlighted the tremendous profit in war making and in marketing and in trafficking in weapons. He's called even the possession of nuclear weapons morally unjustified. In the Holy See, the Vatican's message in 2014 to the Vienna Conference on the humanitarian consequences of a nuclear exchange, even a limited nuclear exchange. At a Vatican conference a few years later on nuclear disarmament in 2017, and during his visit to Japan in 2019, Pope Francis deliberately moved the Catholic commitment to nuclear abolition beyond what had been strictly limited acceptance of the strategy of deterrence based on nuclear weapons to what he called a moral rejection of even the possession of nuclear weapons. The Holy See strongly supported the Nuclear Ban Treaty in 2017, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In January of 2017, Pope Francis wrote what is a World Day of Peace message. Each year, the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, writes a message on January 1st called the World Day of Peace message. In 2017, following the conference that we held in 2016 that was co-sponsored by the Vatican. His message was on nonviolence, a style of politics for peace, on nonviolence as a spirituality, a way of life, an important strategy for transforming conflict, for preventing violence, for protecting vulnerable communities. And it was the first official Catholic statement on nonviolence. So for 2,000 years, Christians have been trying to understand, what does it mean to love your enemies in the contemporary context? What does it mean? How do we live that out in the public arena as well as in our personal lives? The Catholic Church in the last 15 or 20 years has actually begun to grapple with that question, to recognize the possibility that a commitment to nonviolence might not only be the commitment of an individual, a personal commitment, but that it also should be a commitment of an entire community, and it could be a commitment at a public policy level of governments. And part of that is because there's been a recognition over the last decades that nonviolence is not only a faithful way to live out the teachings of Jesus, for those of us who follow Jesus, but it is an effective strategy for engaging with the multiple violences of our world. In the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, we have come to recognize that as a people, we often don't recognize the multiple expressions of violence that are at play in the world. And therefore, we often miss the power of nonviolent action to counter that violence. And so part of our strategy has been to move the Catholic Church to center a commitment to nonviolence, and therefore to teach nonviolence through all of its channels of communication and education, Catholic universities, local parishes and dioceses, Catholic religious communities, and so on, because we believe that churches, religious institutions, have the capacity to do the kind of training and education and consciousness raising that is going to be important if we are going to move our world from permanently being caught in a paradigm, in a framework of violence. If we're going to move from there to a logic of nonviolence, we believe that there is a great deal of work that needs to be done to educate, to do the research necessary to understand how nonviolence works and how applicable it is in many, many different circumstances of violence. We are hopeful that in the coming fairly near term, that the Catholic Church actually will make a commitment to center nonviolence in all of its actions, thereby reclaiming the teaching of Jesus from a few thousand years ago. So thank you.
Thank you, Marie. And Adam, please bring your voice into this.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and what wonderful presentations we've had. Thank you so much. I am going to share my screen if I can and bring in this is going to help me. Michael invited me to come on to kind of talk about René Girard. So I hope that you'll forgive the PowerPoint presentation, or maybe it'll help us in this. So I'll try not to read it fully, but I wanted to talk about Girard and how Girard has helped me with this question of violence and nonviolence, because Marie just said something that was so crucial for me which is Marie, when Marie said that we have this framework of violence and we need to move to a logic of non-violence. And that is so crucial, Marie. I'm so glad that you said it. And Gerard has helped me personally understand how violence infects not just our society, or not just those people that I can accuse of being violent, right? But myself too, and how I can own my own inner violence and move beyond it. Here is a picture of Gerard. He was a Catholic. He preferred, I don't know what, he was a man of many trades. He doesn't like being called a theologian, although he dives into that. He's much more doing anthropology. His magnum opus is Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. So if you're interested in more, I'd invite you to check that out. Ken said something earlier, quoting Walter Wink. Gerard says something very similar to Wink, that Christ took away humanity's sacrificial crutches and left us with a terrible choice. Either believe in violence or not. Christianity is non-belief. And so I'm going to kind of show us how we get there. Mimetic theory is the theory that Gerard came up with. And he came up with it by reading novels. And what he discovered was that humans desire at a non-conscious mimetic level. And mimetic is kind of just this academic term that means non-consciously imitative. And so we are unaware of this mechanism that we have that is, in modern parlance, you might call it keeping up with the Joneses. Right? So we see that our neighbor has a new car and something inside of us thinks, oh man, I wish I had a new car. And that car is so nice. It's so much better than my car. And something inside of us gets resentful towards our neighbor. And we start thinking, that jerk, how did he get the new car? Right. And so this is like a kind of a non-conscious thing that happens within us. And if I start getting upset with my neighbor over other things, I may want to non-consciously bond with my neighbor who was an enemy, but I don't want to be enemies with my neighbor. So what we'll end up doing is I'll start gossiping about our other neighbor down the street, who also like bothers me in some way. And so we will unite in the scapegoat mechanism. We'll scapegoat my neighbor down the street. And what this does is create a bond between me and the neighbor that I had some hostility for against our scapegoat. So this is, you might think of this as uniting against a common enemy. What brings us together more than anything? It's by having a common enemy. Gerard says that this is like there at the foundations of human culture. I'll get to a little bit more later, but you can see this, this working out in the biblical text, Gerard says. Gerard says that at the beginning of human culture is this kind of mechanism of desire that leads people into conflict. And at the beginning of human culture, there's this war of all against all that gets channeled into a war of all against one and brings a sense of peace to the community as they unite against a common enemy. We'll get a little bit more to that as I continue. Going too fast. So basically, human desire is non-consciously, unconsciously mimetic. We don't know what to desire, Gerard says, and so we look to models for what to desire. We know that advertisers know this really well. Put something up on a billboard, a model, somebody who's famous that we all want to be like, right? And all of a sudden, we're all drinking that same beer, or we all want the Rolex watch or something. So this is how Gerard says that human desire works. We look to models for what to desire. And as long as we can share those desires with one another, we might find a mutual friendship over those desires. These mutual desires can bring us together in a shared passion, a shared interest. But if we can't, if we're unwilling to share that interest, the same thing that brings us together as friends can also tear us apart as enemies. You may have heard of the phrase frenemies, right? We can become friends over a shared desire for something. It can be an object, like a shared desire for, I don't know, like my kids like to play video games with their friends. But if they get into super competitive mode of who's going to win at the video game, there can be some very serious conflicts, right? We can also fight over things at work, like a workplace promotion or power or prestige. This happens on the personal level, but it also happens on the national level. America is the greatest nation in the world. America is the model, right? And so what is this going to do? This is going this might invoke envy in other nations as we compete with one another over who is the greatest country in the world. And we can go to war over such stupid conflicts, seemingly stupid conflicts, right? But they feel very real to us in the moment. So this brings the scapegoat mechanism. Generally, Girard says that when we have these shared desires and we come into conflict against one another, we end up channeling those conflicts against a victim, against our sacrificial victim. Scapegoating is something very common. We all know what we mean by scapegoating. That's one of the things that makes this step in mimetic theory very easy to understand, is that the common understanding is Girard says, helpful for us to know. But one of the things that scapegoating does is bonds us together. It's a glue, a common hatred that bonds us together over and against an enemy. And the scapegoat, doesn't matter if the scapegoat is innocent or guilty. All that matters is that the scapegoat functions as a way for the community to unite against and either sacrifice or banish so that we gain a sense of peace for ourselves. Now, scapegoating only solves the problem of our conflicts for a very brief period of time. It doesn't actually solve the conflicts. And so those conflicts will always re-emerge because we never solve it by channeling our conflicts against an innocent victim. This, Girard says, this sacrificial scapegoat mechanism is what forms religion. And so what religion does in the ancient world is a very good thing. We hear frequently how religion is violent. And at the very beginning of human history, and we still see today, how religion is tied in with violence. The sacrificial religions channeled all of the mutual anxieties and conflicts that we have against one another into a violence against a sacrificial victim. So that's where sacrifice ends up forming religion. For Girard, sacrifice comes first, and then religion picks up on it, and over time tells myths, stories, and the sacrificial victim is accused of all of the hostilities within our community. But then there's a sense of peace after the victim is sacrificed, a sense of temporary peace. And so the victim is both seen as the ultimate enemy, but also the giver of peace. This is where you have this ambivalence of the gods. Some of them are, some of the gods at the same time can be wrathful, but also loving. This is often seen in the Christian God as well, despite the fact that the New Testament has one definition or two definitions of God. And one of those is that God is love, period, and that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. But we still project wrath onto God. One of my favorite goddesses is Diana, who is both the god of wild animals and also the god of the hunt. Right here, you see the ambivalence within the gods. Girard says that revealed religions, the prophets of the Old Testament, and Jesus are moving us away from the sacrificial religions of and into a non-sacrificial religion. Just you can read the book of Genesis is a great example of this. Adam and Eve eat the fruit. Eve only eats the fruit because the serpent directs her desire towards the fruit. Eve didn't want the fruit at the beginning. She never wanted to have anything to do with it until the serpent says, hey, that's fruit's good for eating, right? And so then she eats it because she has this mimetic desire. The serpent in the story is mimetic desire or suggested desire. Cain sacrifices his brother Abel, and out of that is the formation of the first culture, the first community. So Girard sees this happening here in the biblical text. There's violence that comes about into the flood, and there's this flood of violence, and God is implicated in that violence in the story. But then in Genesis chapter 12, you get a change in the character of God in Genesis. God comes to Abraham and Sarah and says, basically, I've tried that violence thing, and now we're going to try something different. I'm going to call you in Genesis chapter 12. Here is your job, Abraham and Sarah and your descendants. You are called, I'm going to bless you so that you be a blessing to all the families of the earth. If there's any cursing in the story that God says to Abraham and Sarah, that's God's job. Your job is to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. As the story goes along, we find that all the families of the earth includes even the enemies, even the Egyptians who are going to enslave us. All the families of the earth include them. Even the Assyrians, as we see in the prophets, particularly Jonah. Even the Assyrians are to be blessed by us. The Babylonians, Jeremiah says, be a blessing in the nation that you find yourself in, even if they are your enemy nations. Jesus isn't making up love your enemies out of the blue. He's formed by this tradition that God is giving to Abraham to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. Jacob and Esau have their brotherly conflicts where Jacob steals his brother's birthright. Later on in the story, Esau forgives Jacob, and Jacob says, in you, in this act of forgiveness, in your face, I see the face of God. This is what God is like, forgiveness. Joseph is the scapegoat of his brothers, and they move through their pain and trauma that they've inflicted upon one another into reconciliation. The book of Genesis is this move from violence to nonviolence, both on the human level and in our understanding of God, from a violent God that will destroy even the earth to a nonviolent God who is there to bless all the families of the earth. That's the move that Genesis makes. Jesus is the model. If we all need models, Jesus says, follow me. And this is crucial for our understanding of the nonviolence of Jesus. The Son of God language. Marie talked beautifully about the early Christian movement and its interaction with the Roman Empire. In the ancient world, if you were to talk about the Son of God, your model for that would have been the Roman emperor. And how the Son of God was a title given to someone who was to kind of reveal who God is. What are the gods like? Well, you look to the Son, and the Roman emperor's Son of God is the one who shows us what God is like. And in that sense, the Roman emperor brings peace through the sword, brings peace through violence. The name Son of God for the early Christians is a subversion of this violence of the Roman Empire. Why? Because the true Son of God, the true representation of God the Father, God of Jesus, is the non-violent one who refuses to act with violence, but would rather take violence upon himself and offer forgiveness and the hope of reconciliation in return. Jesus models for us the true God. And as those of us, as all of us here who love Gandhi, know that he was influenced by turning the other cheek, love of enemy. Gandhi also saw that Jesus was active in his nonviolence by setting his face towards Jerusalem, setting his face towards the cross, which motivated Gandhi to set his face towards the salt protest, right? But Jesus, as Gandhi knew, wasn't killed because he told us to love one another. Jesus was killed because he actively resisted the oppression of his day, the economic, religious, and political oppression. Gandhi used Jesus as a model for how to do the same thing during his day, as did Martin Luther King Jr., as do many of us today. So I'm almost to the end here. Humans have been sacrificing, scapegoating from the very beginning. This, Girard says, is in our social DNA. That's how embedded scapegoating and violence is inside of us. And so we need different models. Jesus is a model. Gandhi is a model. Martin Luther King is a model. Dorothy Day, many models for us today to kind of root this out of us so that we can own it for ourselves and move into a more peaceful world. Just a few more quotes here from the book of Revelation, and the nonviolence scene there is let anyone who has an ear listen. If you are to be taken captive, into captivity you go. If you kill with the sword you must be killed. Here is a call to the endurance and the faith of the saints. The endurance and the faith of the saints for Revelation, which admittedly is a very strange book, but the endurance of the faith is the endurance of nonviolence. And the only reason that you would ever be led into captivity is because you are, what John Lewis says, causing some good trouble, working for justice. And so may we continue to cause some good trouble in the realm of Revelation and Jesus and Gandhi and Martin Luther King in the endurance of the faith of love and nonviolence. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. I'd like to invite Marie and Michael into the conversation with you, Adam, and see if we can cause some good trouble. So, Michael, let's start with you. Any reflections on what Francesca and Ken and Marie and Adam have shared?
Yeah, Adam, I actually had this conversation with Renee about 30 years ago, I guess. And his work led me to a kind of insight. I don't think he agreed with me, by the way, but I'll share it anyway, that in the crucifixion of Jesus, we can look on it in two different ways. We're supposed to look upon it as a warning, a stark warning. If the best of you can be killed in this horrible manner, something is terribly, terribly wrong. And that something is to kill, to commit violence against others. That, I believe, is what Jesus meant that act to be. But instead, we take it as a scapegoat in the old ritualistic sense, that he's taken all our sins off and now whoopee, let's party. And soon enough, we're going to need another scapegoat, like maybe that neighboring country is a good one. So he really, I think, laid his finger on a crisis in human consciousness, exemplified by that one incredible act, that one incredible human being.
Beautiful. I don't know. I agree with you. So I think that's a great way to put it. Yeah. And tragically, I'm seeing some Amy has made some very good comments referring to Abraham and the near sacrifice of Isaac in that story. And God provides, as Amy says, a scapegoat, the ram, to sacrifice instead. I think this is, Amy, you're pointing to an excellent movement within the Jewish scriptures of a move away from human sacrifice towards something maybe a little better, animal sacrifice, and moving even further away towards the prophets who say God didn't want your sacrifice at all. Right? Animal sacrifice, human sacrifice, that's the pinnacle of the prophetic message. God doesn't want your sacrifices. God wants justice and mercy. Right. And this is ultimately the point, Michael, that I think that you are making too, is that Jesus, for Gerard, is supposed to be the last scapegoat, taking away our sacrificial crutches. But we have to find a different way of doing this. And Jesus models it. But are we actually going to follow him? And that's where Gerard says, history shows maybe not, as Marie has beautifully shown us, but there's hope, as Marie has also beautifully shown us too.
Go ahead, Michael, and then we'll bring Marie in.
Yeah, I'm eager to get to you, Maria, but one quick comment, Marie. I love what Augustine did with the sacrifice, which is to say, it's real, all right, but instead of sacrificing something outside, even the innocent animal who had nothing to do with it, you're supposed to sacrifice your bestiality. And he elaborates that just beautifully in the City of God. I think he got it. I think that was what Jesus intended his sacrifice to stand for, but it was a pretty subtle message, unfortunately.
So just thank you, Adam. That was very interesting and helpful. What it stirred in me were two slightly different directions of thought. One of them being, I do believe that the gift of scholarship over the last, 100 years, that began to really understand the context in which Jesus lived has been a door opener to much of this conversation. And I think that from my perspective, the work that we've been doing in the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has been, to the best of our ability, rooted in the different contexts around the world. So our strategy has been to invite people living with violence who are committed to nonviolence to share their experience and reflect on that, on the sort of reasons, what motivates their commitment to nonviolence, but also on the effective strategies and approaches that they're able to find that are useful in different contexts, different cultures, different kinds of violence, and so on. So I feel like that was also a very, very important insight as we look at the context in which Jesus was living. And as you said, he was crucified, I believe, because he pushed back on the violence. And that's also a lesson for us to pay attention to. But the larger question that I would invite your comments on is actually, for the last number of years, we have been trying to articulate clearly what a global ethic rooted in nonviolence might look like. One of the advantages of what has been the just war tradition in the Christian sort of community has been it's very clear. it's almost never applied in a thorough way. So usually there'll be some attention to, is it a just cause, or, but we're convinced that there isn't any war situation in these times that would adequately meet all of those criteria. But the world we need an ethical framework in which to shape our decisions. The war in Ukraine is a very, very challenging situation for all of us, because we're watching an aggressor and seeing a people who are defending themselves to the best of their ability in this context. I'm convinced that we ask the wrong question if we ask whether the Ukraine war is a just war, because it just doesn't get nearly deep enough into the questions. But how we shape something that would be useful in the context of a very particular kind of violence, but that would prepare us to be able to use the nonviolent, the multitude of nonviolent strategies that are available. We're trying to move the conversation to a larger place, to say, the fault in Ukraine, for example, has something to do with failing to pay attention to the root causes of the situation in Ukraine and in the post-Soviet years in Eastern Europe, on the part of the world, and then all the way to how are we supporting the many nonviolent movements in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, in Belarus, even now. So what is your thinking about a useful global ethic that would guide the thinking of the global community, or of a nation, or of a community of people, as we're moving into the future, where we can't continue with the kind of violence that we're living with now, or we simply won't exist. So how do we think at a useful level about a global ethic rooted in nonviolence?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Marie. I'd like to invite Jim back into this conversation. Jim has spoken on a number of episodes about how for centuries the Russians have dealt with being invaded by Napoleon, by Hitler and others, and that Putin had attempted for the last couple of decades to join NATO, to be part of the European Union, and seemingly in some way trying to avoid violence, to avoid conflict. And so I'm wondering how we could bring some of that, since you brought up Ukraine, and specifically to your question, Marie, around a global ethic.
Well, thank you, Tom and Marie and Michael and Adam. I've loved Rene Girard brought back into. He's such a nuanced and profound mind. I read several of his books many, many years ago when I was doing my dissertation on the ethical implications of nuclear weapons. And he was extremely helpful. So I was just luxuriating in your presentation there. But just very quickly to address Tom's point and Marie's point on Ukraine, I think it's worth pausing here just for a moment to say that right now the mass media is labeling Putin as the great enemy. But if you look at the situation from the larger historical flow, global flow, Marie, this is all about the United States and NATO pushing relentlessly to the east in violation of the very foundational agreement that Gorbachev had with George Bush Sr., Maggie Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and on the basis of which the Soviets left Eastern Europe and allowed Germany to be reunited. The agreement was that the United States would not push NATO to the east. And starting with Bill Clinton, they did. And Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin have all said, we're not your enemy. We want to join NATO and join the EU. And it was the United States that refused to allow this to happen because of the militarism in the US kind of political elite and the notion that this is our unipolar moment, we can crush these guys. And so if you look at what Putin's doing, and this is really important, everyone, when you think about violence and nonviolence, Putin's not trying to attack and regain any territory. All he's doing, as the US has taken over 99% of what the Soviets surrendered, is just the land bridge to secure Russia a land bridge to the Black Sea in a country that has historically been Russia. And that's important that we bear that in mind, because we support Israel the Jews going back to Israel, and they haven't been there for 2,000 years. Russia has been Ukraine and Ukraine Russia for 1,000 years. It's only been in the last 20, 30 years, since 1991, that Ukraine was even a country. And so when we talk about violence and we talk about nonviolence, it's this is where Girard, to me, is so profound, because he holds, Adam, as you point out, violence and nonviolence are inseparable. And the challenge of the human psyche is to blend them in a way that's redemptive. And that's the genius, it feels to me, of Jesus on the cross. And just to take another moment, Tom, and we can go beyond the time because this is so rich, it's important to point out that Jesus wasn't all that nonviolent. He was tossing out the money changers. He was using language against the Pharisees and the Sadducees that was scandalous. And that he wasn't crucified because of his nonviolence. He was crucified because he was resisting the power elites of his time with a ferociousness that finally they decided the only way to deal with this guy is to kill him. And so that what Girard is pointing to in my mind, which I hope was as an ongoing topic here, is it's not nonviolence as opposed to violence. It is how you bring the two together in a way, as I said, that's ultimately redemptive. Because sometimes, as Nelson Mandela said, you've got to use violence to resist the regime. And he was a great hero of our time. So I think that's a piece of this conversation I would love to bring in and hear more about, because it's such a deep and complex issue. Jung grapples with this intermingling of the violent and the nonviolent and what he calls the antinomial nature of reality, where two things can be mutually exclusive, internally consistent because of their exclusivity to one another, and yet be completely interrelated. And I think that's what we've got in this complexio between violence and nonviolence that we need to seriously grapple with.
So there's a whole lot there. I'm wondering, Adam, Michael,
what do you say? Adam, Marie, Tom, what do you say? What say you?
Michael, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think I'll jump in on the same foot that I hopped over on before. I think that the approach of Augustine and others to interiorize the sacrifice is precisely that union that you were speaking about, that we turn the violence against the evil that we can reach, and must importantly recognize that that first evil we can reach is within us. Now, the other point I'd like to make is something that I put this in the chat. In my book, The Search for a Nonviolent Future, I made a distinction. Okay, so I'm a professor, I deal with words, and maybe I'm being kind of shifty here, just playing games with semantics. But I said, let's distinguish between violence and the use of destructive force. Now, if you look closely at the word ahimsa, which of course was the ancestor of nonviolence, it actually means, I mean, this is a linguistic fact, it actually means the absence of the intention to harm. So when a surgeon operates on you, he is doing something which, if you were a fly on the wall, you might say, oh my God, what a horrible thing. It has rendered this person helpless and he's cutting them up. But he is doing that without an intention to harm. So force can be used where you do not intend harm with it, but it must be in a kind of surgical way. Now, of course, that's tricky, because the minute you start using the violence, your emotions kick in, and the himsa is again prominent. But I think it's worth dealing with that subtlety a little bit, because it helps disentangle our issue of needing to struggle hard against what is unjust, between that and violence. I'm finished.
Adam, you want to jump in?
Yeah, Jim, let's see. Deanna, I hope I'm saying your name right. Deanna says in the chat section, Jim, wow, that's a lot to digest, Jim. So thank you for prompting that. And there was that awkward pause because we're all digesting what you just said. So it was excellent, and very thought-provoking. I think that one of the things that I am motivated by now, my colleague at the Raven Foundation, the founder, Suzanne Ross, said to me recently, the people aren't the problem is the problem. And I think that that's very much in line with, St. Paul in, I think it's Ephesians, where he says that our struggle is not with flesh and blood, but with the powers and principalities, right? And I think that's what Jesus is doing when he goes into the temple. He's shutting down the sacrificial mechanism, even in the Gospel of John, where he creates the whip, right? And I think you're right that this is a violent act. Clearly, like if you're like the fly on the wall, right? You're like, whoa, what's going on here from this nonviolent peace activist, right? But he's like getting people out of there, and he's it's very clear that in the Gospel of John, the only place where he's got the whip, that he's whipping towards the animals, not towards the humans, right? Not towards the people, in order to get the animals out and not be sacrificed. Right. So he's using this violence in order to save life from being killed, to get them out of this system that is producing more and more death. And when he's doing this, by the way, this is a very Jewish move. I don't want this to be seen as like against Judaism. I mean, the prophets were oftentimes talking about how the temples had become corrupt. So Jesus is simply in line with prophets like Jeremiah when the temple becomes corrupt. So I'm going to have to chew much more, as Deanna says, that's a lot to digest, what you said, Jim. And I'm going to have to chew on that some more and more. So thank you for your comments. I hope mine have been somewhat helpful in that regard.
Marie, have you had enough time to digest? And
Not nearly.
I know, right?
No, but I will continue to digest. No, thank you, that Jim, and thank you, all of you, Adam, Michael, all of you. They're huge questions. I guess because my instinct is always very concrete. I feel as though we have so much work to do to understand in very specific, concrete circumstances, how do we negotiate violence and how do we use nonviolence in an effective way? I think that the sort of all of the above, all of what you have all been saying is food for really deep thought. And I guess my hope is that we can begin to have these conversations more at a more sort of ordinary space in our societies. I think that someone in the chat commented on, going back to Ukraine, commented on how infrequently in the ordinary media we are hearing the stories about the many, many ways that the people of Ukraine and that area are both acting with effective nonviolent approaches, but strategizing together and planning together and learning how nonviolence might serve well, not only at this moment, but into the future, whatever that holds. So I guess what I'm going to be pondering is how to bring together these very deep and very important theological, philosophical explorations and ways of thinking with how do we practically prepare ourselves to be nonviolent in a very violent world. And I think it's just really challenging. So I've got a lot of learning and a lot of thinking to do for sure.
Well, Marie, just picking up on I share with you that practical desire to give people the tools and the resources, and so many of the things we produce together, the individual stories where people have witnessed violence, where they have been a victim of it or a perpetrator of it, and what they carry inside them, and those stories are incredibly powerful for each of us, and we all can point to moments in our life where we have grief, we have remorse, we have, and that's just for, violent words, violent actions that we've taken that didn't necessarily create physical harm to someone, but still created that sense of remorse and grief. And Michael, certainly you and I've had multiple conversations since the conflict in Ukraine with people on the ground there and some of the nonviolent actions they've been taking. Anything you'd like to share?
I think you said it, Tom, that it's helpful to remind ourselves every now and then that human motivation is complex, and the terms violence and nonviolence are a rather simple dichotomy, and they sometimes won't quite accommodate what is actually going on in the human being. But as I said yesterday, it's very clear that people who actually commit harm against others, even if they're told that they're protecting freedom and democracy and their country, that they're hurting themselves inwardly. And that I think is the key realization we have to bring out. No such thing as hurting another person and being benefited by that. On some level, we are so much this one that the infliction of harm directed outwardly is doing just as much harm on the other end of the gun. That's why Azim Kamisa, whose son was randomly shot in a meaningless act of gang violence, he said he saw a victim on both sides of the gun. The person who fired the shot, who was in fact now in prison, and his 26-year-old son who was killed.
Well, Marie, I'd like to go back to the question you posed around a global ethic, and wondering if we want to close today's program with each of your thoughts about what form that might take.
To be honest, that was my question. I think that there are I think there has been great work done to articulate that, but I think I've not seen sort of one expression that captures it clearly, and I would be very interested in seeing that. So it's the future, the question for the future in my mind.
Jim, Adam, Michael, any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say, Maria, that this is the $64,000 question, and I think humanity has a ways to go before that ethic will emerge, because I don't think it can come as an abstraction. I think it can only come out of a new imaginative story that redefines us to ourselves, out of which the ethos comes. I think Adam was making a very profound point, or rather Rene Girard was, that sacrifice came first, then religion. That as we behave and as we interact, we rationalize and we mythologize because we're seeking deep identity. And I think right now we're not in the old, but we're not yet in the new. And that's part of the agony of what it means to be human in this particular generation. The mountain is no longer a mountain. It will be again, but we have a little bit of work before at least I could answer your question in a meaningful way.
Thank you. I totally agree with that.
I don't know how to answer it either in a super meaningful way, other than Marie, to say that you are doing that excellent work. And I'm just like, I love hearing you talk about the work that you're doing, especially like, Gandhi struggled with, and King struggled with this idea that nonviolence is ineffective. That's the default that we have, that we are taught throughout our culture, is that really it's violence. That's when push comes to shove, and even before push comes to shove, violence is the way to get what you want. And how do we combat that idea that nonviolence is ineffective? Because as you've been saying, and as the stories that you've been telling, nonviolence is more effective. And so how do we change? I think for me, whenever I go to folks and talk about nonviolence, that's cute. It's nice. Right. Yeah. Good. Yeah. But really, come on, live in the real world. How do we get people to live in the real world, right? Where we see that nonviolence is more effective. That's, I think, one of the big struggles that we're facing, because as Girard tells us, violence is so ingrained within all of us. How do we change that narrative is part of the key.
Yeah.
Well, and I think just if I could add one point about the tragedy of Ukraine. One of the things that people have commented over the decades now is that when the world came to mutual assured destruction, there was less and less international violence. There were civil strife, but if you look at the arc of violence, the record of violence, it hit a crescendo with Second World War. Then all of a sudden we could annihilate each other, and the violence tapered off. And there's been 75 years of peace in Europe, and there's been the Balkans and Yugoslavia, but by and large, the world seemed to be repenting of war. And then all of a sudden you've got Ukraine and a conflagration and a realignment of the strategic tectonic plates with Russia and China and so forth and so on. And I think all of us just went, oh, not again. We've got to be more mature than this to just go down that rat hole in such a senseless moment when we should be cooperating together to deal with the real crisis of climate that's spinning out of control. We need the Russians, we need the Chinese, we need the Indians and the Saudis to all work together, and we're fighting each other. Come on, man. So I think part of the angst around Ukraine is the tragedy of it and how far it's setting all our human aspirations back in a way that seems at the present moment unredeemable. Which makes the call to nonviolence. That's why I was so enthusiastic about this program and said, let's do 10 days, you know, because God knows we've got to have this conversation. It's complex, but we've got to have this conversation. We've got to. We just have to.
Michael, did you have a comment?
First of all, Jim, I completely agree with basically everything you said, and that's rare. And, Maria, I don't have an answer to your question about a global ethic, but I think I have a reason why we don't have one. And that is, if the late Norman Cousins, he said, the next step in human progress cannot take place until we have a more accurate, agreed upon image of what a human being is.
Yeah.
That is the infrastructure, if you will, of the ethic that you're so correctly calling for.
Yeah, and that's a new story.
That is precisely a new story.
A new mythology of what is a human being.
Now, many people who have promoted with versions of the new story don't get nearly that deep, because they're trying to build a new narrative on the old infrastructure. But let's not go there.
What I would say is, in my view, Marie, the beginnings of the new story are coming out of the realization that the most essential reality of our humanity is that we are one with nature. We are nature. And that's one reason why I have the trees behind me. And we start every day with a reminder of the most essential fact that we've forgotten that humanity is nature.
Right.
And it feels to me that that's the great gift of the environmental movement in beginning the generative impulse that needs a lot of scaffolding and needs a lot of refinement. But the bottom line on the new story is that we're not separate from nature. We are nature.
Absolutely. I am so sorry, but I have got to step off this call. But
Thank you,
it was
Marie.
wonderful to talk with all of you. And I completely agree. I think this new cosmology, what we're learning from the Webb telescope, is teaching us a whole new understanding of who we are. So thank you so much. Sorry to have to leave, but
it's okay. Tom, before we jump off, just tell us a little bit about tomorrow.
Sure. Tomorrow is going to be a continuation of the conversation we've been having. The title for it is What's Peace Got to Do with It? The True Nature of Humanity, Nonviolence and Peace. And we've got a couple of wonderful guests joining us tomorrow. We've got the extraordinary Indian actress Nadita Das, who has taken a lot of her notoriety and fame in film, and her passion for this topic and this work. And then we've got Douglas Fry from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro.
Wow. Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Michael, for putting together such an incredible program. My goodness. And Adam, thank you for bringing in Renee Girard. That was brilliant, man. It just satisfied this intellectual part of me that has been thirsting for Girard for some time. I picked up his book, Violence Unveiled.
Violence in the Sacred.
Violence in the Sacred. Yeah,
there you go. Yeah. Violence, a brilliant book, everyone. Well worth reading. So thank you all for this wonderful session. We'll come back again tomorrow for day 3 of 10 days on this. I want to remind you of the Third Harmony as the documentary that Tom and others have produced. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link that Stan just put in the chat box. And we'll see you all again tomorrow, same time, same station, here on Humanity Rising, for conversations that really matter and how they can be transformed into actions that can make a real difference. That's humanity rising. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.